For more, Ed Owen joins me now. He is a former UK government advisor and currently a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. Ed, good to have you on the show. Thanks very much for joining us. It started out well, I have to say. Donald Trump seemed very charmed, by that letter from King Charles and that invitation, for a second state visit. But he since doubled down, on saying he's not going to provide an actual security backdrop. So my question is there anything you think might change his mind on this particular issue?
Well, I think firstly to say that I think the expectations on the British side for the visit to Washington today, the meeting that Prime Minister Starmer had with President Trump, was probably not to come away with any great results. As you and your viewers may know, President Macron of France was in Washington on Monday for similar discussions with President Trump. I don't think that Keir Starmer would have expected to persuade, in a 1-hour meeting, persuade President Trump to change his mind. I think this is more about exploring. It was about cementing the relationship, firstly, between the two men. And that obviously happened, as you've reflected. The chemistry between the two men was very good. And I think so from the Prime Minister of the UK's perspective, I think this is more about exploring where are those areas that there potentially could be some coming together of the US position and the Europe position. And to some extent, that was Keir Starmer's ambition here. He came really trying on that issue, very much representing a collective European position. I agree with you completely that in a sense he hasn't received any, if you like, that where the European position wants the US to be. But I think he would have come away with a better sense of where there may be some areas where those two positions can be brought together. And it's obvious that Donald Trump is very focused on ending the fighting. That's right. That's good. But obviously the European and Keir Starmer's perspective is about long-term guarantees to make sure that any cessation in fighting is one that has a sustainable, lasting effect. And that's really where the two positions are. And I sense that there may be some movement. It's going to take time. It was never going to come out from this meeting that suddenly Donald Trump was going to change his mind. I think there are areas, I think, that have come out of the meeting where I think there is some further exploration. I'm sure that Keir Starmer would have impressed upon President Trump that the European position is not seeking American troops to be stationed in Ukraine as any part of any peacekeeping force. This is this will be a European commitment. The issue is whether the Americans are willing to provide the infrastructure, the logistics, something of the air cover that can maintain and provide that peacekeeping force alongside those long-term security guarantees for Ukraine. It's not there yet. This is going to take some time to discuss.
Right, understood. Ed, would you say, though, that both Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer have at least softened the ground ahead of Volodymyr Zelensky's visit? I mean, we know that Trump is no longer calling Zelensky a dictator, for example. And he's also actually said during the press conference that, the US would actually try and help Kyiv regain territory seized by Russia.
Yeah. I think that's a very good point. And I think that certainly President Trump's language has changed from where it was at the beginning of the week. And I'm sure that the combined efforts of President Macron earlier in the week and Prime Minister Starmer today has helped shift some of that position of the US and particularly of Donald Trump himself. So that's good. And as you say, it prepares the ground for President Zelensky of Ukraine's visit to the US to sign this minerals deal. So that's good news. And so this is a process. This is now where the real art of diplomacy takes place. It's not going to come in big shocks. We've had that. This is now going to come from painstaking work and discussion.
And there was alarm in Europe about earlier comments that Donald Trump made earlier today. He actually praised the UK's planned increase in defense spending and also said he supports NATO's mutual defense obligations under Article 5. I'm wondering how you would interpret that in the context of European peacekeepers in Ukraine? I mean, many of them are NATO members, for example.
Yes, and also he also said, didn't he say in the press conference after the meeting with Prime Minister Starmer, he reiterated the strong support that militarily that the US has always provided to the UK, and implicitly remarked on the fact that if UK forces were under threat, they could rely on American support to defend them in that situation. So I think the language, I think you've reflected that correctly. I think the language has shifted. I don't think we've yet seen the substantive shifts that Europe wants. But there are now a range of discussions that are going to take place. And I think that the Europeans will see the end of this week as being something of a result in helping to shift some of the chemistry of this, where, as you say, Donald Trump and the President Trump is now articulating a more pro-Ukraine position and is willing to, I think, to explore certain areas. We're not there yet. Mm-hmm. It may be that the ultimate outcome of this is a more phased issue, but in many ways, if you think about the Gaza conflict, where we've going through this painstaking process of a ceasefire and a phased process to a longer-term settlement, there may be something equivalent to that that will transpire, which can bring all these different elements together.
Right.
But I say all that to say that there's lots more discussion and negotiation to get to that point.
I hear you, and which brings me to my next question, Ed. The U.S. leader touching on that minerals agreement with Ukraine, calling it the basis for a more sustainable future relationship. And implicit there is, that this relationship translates into an automatic security guarantee. Some skepticism, but also, I mean, is there an element of truth in that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting element. And I get the impression that, and it's an impression from the meeting today, that has had some impact on Prime Minister Starmer's position. And there is some truth in the fact that with significant US investment of people, of resource in the reconstruction, the American government, whichever president is in power, is not going to sit idly by if those people and those investments are going to be put under threat from future Russian aggression. So yes, I think there is something in that. It won't satisfy ultimately the European position, and certainly won't satisfy the Ukrainian position, that Ukrainian sovereignty requires a more stated position which is about deterring President Putin from any future aggression. Right. And that will remain. But I think you're right that has introduced an interesting new element to the discussions.
Right. I'm glad you brought up President Putin, because the US and Russian officials have met for a second round of talks in Istanbul. And I'm wondering whether or not, Donald Trump has this in mind, given his reluctance. Is he, I suppose, holding his cards closer to his chest when it comes to potential negotiations with Putin? Is that something that he's thinking about as he's asked questions about whether or not he's going to provide that U.S. backstop?
I think I think President Trump started this process. So I think President Trump's goal, I think has been clearly stated by himself and by others, was to stop the fighting and to provide some opportunity for reconstruction, which would provide some commercial and financial advantages for the US, not least as compensation for the investment that the Americans have made over the last 3 years of the war. So those have been his goals. And so to some extent, those goals require, and he's regarded the concession, if you like, to be made is more on the Ukrainian side than the Russian side. So in a sense, he's obviously invested a lot in the relationship with President Putin to get Putin to the point where he's willing to stop the fighting. I think Trump thinks that Putin in the end could keep this fighting going on indefinitely, whereas the Ukrainians, backed by the West, don't have that unlimited resource and effort and energy to do it. So there's a lot of effort he's put into that relationship with Putin to hopefully get, from his perspective, get the Russians to give up the fighting. That, of course, is what is worrying the Ukrainians and the Europeans, because the worry is that the focus on ending the fighting ignores that long-term security, which is inherently important to the Ukrainians and to the rest of Europe, because we know that the President Putin, the agreements he reaches are not really worth very much. And what the great fear is that the fighting stops, there's a pause in the conflict, Russia regroups, and then at the appropriate time down the line, some years later, they restart the war. That's obviously a great fear in the Ukrainian and European perspective. So that's really where the differences lie, and it's about trying to get some reconciliation of those points.
Understood, Ed. We do have to leave it here. Thank you so much for the fascinating insights, Ed. Ed Owen is a former UK government advisor and non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council.